pushback and concerns from students, admin, colleagues, and families about getting rid of grades or anything that fits under that category. Fortunately, Isaac wasn't able to join me today, but I am really happy to be answering questions for folks and just kind of working through some of those bigger questions that you probably get as you start thinking about doing something a little less traditional. Because I am on my own, I'm going to apologize ahead of time that on the program I use, I can't necessarily see who's writing comments, but I will do my best to address the comments that I see, and we'll come back later to help out with any additional questions. I did want to start with some of the more typical sort of challenges that people have. Usually when I say I don't grade, there's a litany of questions that come about motivation. People are concerned that students aren't going to take learning seriously if grades aren't attached to it. Some teachers and parents feel like we need to have grades, especially at the secondary level for colleges. So I have some answers for all of those major questions. First of all, as long as you could delay the grade as much as possible, I know a lot of folks have requirements in schools where they have to give grades, and I did as well when I was in New York City schools. But there are plenty of ways around putting a grade on every single thing that you do. So what I would recommend doing is providing substantial feedback until you get to a summative part where you can give a grade that you kind of confer with students about, and report cards would be the secondary part where you could be having conferences with students so that their voices are a part of that process as well. And the grades aren't arbitrary, they're decided with the student. And I'm going to stop for a second. My cat is being very annoying. So come here, buddy. Come here. Come here. I'm not sure if you can hear him or not, but it is loud. And that's really important, that we kind of help everybody understand that grades are not a necessity for learning. I do understand that a lot of students are motivated by grades and do speak about grades. So there is some unprogramming that you kind of have to do with students when you take this away. They've spent a good amount of time in a system that has used grades as labels to judge and track them all along the way. So it's not going to be readily easy for them to give up that concept. The system, the structures that predate them, their parents' experiences of being in school, their teachers' experiences of being in school, and their administrators' experiences of being in school all color the way they understand themselves as learners. So when we take away something that is an embedded structure inside of that traditional system, we have to fill it with something else that they are going to be able to understand and see value in. And what I used to say to parents was, you're going to get more information now than you ever got before. And you really need to think about, does a grade like 85 really tell you anything about how much a student knows about their writing or about a piece of literature or how much science content they know? It just gives you this arbitrary number. And if you don't know what the test was on, what does that 85 actually mean? It doesn't mean very much. So we want to move away from averaging. We want to move away from labeling of the grades. And we want to have that conversation as to why we're doing it, so that students really do understand the purpose, and their families do too, without too much worry and concern that they won't be able to get into college because, we're doing things differently in our classrooms. You can still put a grade on a report card, even if you aren't giving grades regularly in class. And like I said, that's something you could do via conference, so that students are articulating their learning in a way that maybe traditional assessments don't necessarily do. For parents, the first thing that you could do is stop asking your kids what they got. The mark of learning isn't what they did on a test, it's what did they learn. So if you shift that conversation from what did you get to what did you learn, and challenge your children to start articulating what content they're studying, what skills they're learning, and start having those conversations with your children, then it'll normalize the idea of not talking about learning in terms of a number or a letter. And that's really important. Your colleagues might also be giving you some challenges here, because if you share students with them and in your class you're doing something one way and in their class they're doing something that doesn't align with it necessarily, you definitely want to think about how you can have conversations with your colleagues about how the practices, might not align with each other. And this might be a bigger school conversation about assessment policies, moving away from this idea of even grading policies, but more thinking big picture about what we value as educators, how we're teaching kids to talk about their learning. Is everybody using reflection? Is everybody using multiple means to assess students, not just quizzes and tests and written papers, but projects and a lot of formative learning opportunities in class where we get a lot of information about what kids know and can do. And that's really important if we want to be able to adjust our instruction. Assessment at the summative place, like end of year exams and state exams, they don't really help the teacher necessarily with the students they have right now, and they don't necessarily help the teachers with the students they have next year. The tests change so readily and the kids' needs are different. So the data that we get at the end of a year only tells a district, how well they did at this moment, and really how well at very specific things that an external force has decided was important. And that's something, again, that we need to discuss in schools to downplay the importance of those state exams, because they aren't necessarily the best way to assess all learners. And that's something we need to think about. I am curious right now. I'm going to just have a look at the calendar, and I'm going to post it again just because I'm curious to see if anybody had questions this week, which there don't appear to be right now. But here is the calendar again. If folks do want to add some thoughts about what questions they might have, what specific pushback they've gotten, if there's anything specific you'd like me to address today, I would love to be able to do that for you. In this environment where a lot of schools are hybrid right now, and especially after the spring, I know a lot of folks were exploring alternative means for assessing because it didn't feel right to do it the way we'd always done it in the current environment. And although I'm super glad that people are starting to wake up to that now, I think that the way that we always do grades in a lot of ways is kind of inhumane to children, in that we start sorting them. They become less like little people and little learners or adult people growing into those places, and they just become data points. And kids are so much more than that. And I know all of you who may be watching right now know that kids are more than what they show. And our assessments sometimes too don't give them every opportunity to show what they know. So there's a big conversation right there too about what our assessments say, what we value, how many opportunities we're giving kids to show their learning in different ways. And then making sure that we're really clear about what our expectations are. And once we make that clear, we are also making sure that what we assess is what we said we were going to assess, and not other things that often fall into play. And I'll give you an example. As an English teacher, I feel compelled sometimes to give comments and feedback on everything. But if we're working on a draft and there's a very specific thing that kids are supposed to be working on, and I'm telling them that basically what I'm looking for is how well they've selected evidence to support their thesis, and then I start marking up a lot of things that have nothing to do with that, that can be very discouraging for students. We need to make sure that if we say we're going to be looking for something specific, that we actually do that. And that doesn't mean we're ignoring all the other stuff. It just means for now, that's not the purpose of this assessment. So being really clear about the purpose of why students are doing the learning so that we can address those specific things in the things that we're talking about. And we don't overburden kids with too much feedback that they're not going to use. We want to give just enough so that it's actionable and that we could see positive growth in the students that we're working with. And we want to make sure too that we validate some of the things we notice that is improving in that specific area as well, so that kids feel really good about it. Some of you who might have been starting to do this work without the blessing of your administrators, maybe you were just dabbling, and you might have some concern for how you address this with your administrators. How do you get them to sign on? I have two specific pieces of evidence, advice. And I want you to think about this. First of all, if you aren't tenured, I recommend that you kind of toe the line until you're tenured, unless you have a very supportive administration that understands your ideas and will be supportive of what you're trying to do. If you are tenured, what I recommend doing is not asking for permission first. I recommend that you try it out on a few smaller assignments, maybe for a marking period. You gather some data, you show your administrators that students are learning and this is how you know, and present that data at that time, and then start expanding from there. The evidence will never lie, the data will never lie. So what I'm trying to tell you is that if you're taking these risks, really do track the work that you're doing, maybe get some students who could articulate how the learning has been helpful. I have a bunch of posts on my website about student responses to going gradeless. I also have parent responses. I really tried to document everything I was doing when I first started to make this journey, and I think it's a really good idea to do that. Other structures I put in place to address pushback and concerns was my YouTube channel. I wanted parents to be able to see the learning that was happening in my class, so I often live streamed what was happening in my classes so that the learning was really visible. I worked in a journalism school, so students had waivers. The privacy issues weren't there because most parents had already signed up to let their kids be on camera, so that was how we addressed that issue. I was available on social media. We were using social media as a back channel in the class, so there was a class hashtag that parents could go on as well, as another way for them to see the learning and engage with their children. We did extra help both virtually and during school. I had conferencing time. I always answered emails when they came through, and I did my best to get on the phone with parents who were concerned with reporting of learning in those different places. So there are lots of things that you could do within the systems you already have in place. It just takes a little bit of thinking about things more creatively when communicating with families and your colleagues and your administrators. If you have a committee at school that deals with assessment policies and assessments in general, if you're a portfolio school, I recommend getting on to those committees. Any place where your voice is going to be heard and where you could influence the group in that way, I think is really useful. I'm a big fan of portfolios, and when you go gradeless, having a portfolio is a great way to support and have evidence for student growth and learning. And we're going to be talking about portfolios, I believe, on October 9th, which is our last hacking assessment Q&A set up that we're going to be doing in this beginning of the year series. Next week, we're going to be talking about those grading conferences, specifically in distance learning environments, and how you can be doing them in your schools if you're on a hybrid schedule right now. And what I'm going to recommend for today, since I'm by myself and just kind of talking at the screen instead of, talking with Isaac or another partner, is if you happen to have questions about pushback in any way, from students, admin, colleagues, and families, just drop them into the comment box and I will make sure to answer them as quickly as I can. Anyway, I hope everyone is having a great Friday and that school is going smoothly for everyone. I actually have my 10th grade son in the other room doing school from home right now, so I could empathize with those folks who are working from home and also have children working from home, and the various challenges that also creates. Just as a reminder, like I said, next week we will be talking about grading conferences in distant learning environments. I do have some resources on the calendar topics page already, which I posted. And if you have specific questions or resources you'd like to share, we'd love to have them. Thank you so much again for another great week, and I will speak to everybody next week. Have a great one. Oh, and Happy New Year to my Jewish friends and colleagues out there. Lashana Tova, and wish